Welcome to all of you who are entering. It will be just another minute as everyone gets through and onto the webinar. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm very excited about this webinar today. I'd like to welcome you. This is the Lessons from Women Leaders in Operations and Supply Chain Management. And as many of you know, March is Women's History Month. And it was really started to increase awareness of how much women have contributed to the events and movements that have shaped our history. And often to tell the stories that were untold. Because as I like to say, role models matter, right? My name is Linda Dunn, and I'm the faculty director for the Supply Chain Management Master's Program here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. And the idea for this webinar, I just need to share, really came from our faculty. We were having a meeting and we were saying, what would really help students as far as advice, really excite them about what we could do. And we decided that having role models such as the three we have today, our panelists, come and speak about how they've navigated their careers in these fields that are often male-dominated when you think of the percentage of women, would be wonderful. And so the whole faculty was behind this. And so very excited about that. And our goal of the webinar is really to increase awareness, similar to Women's History Month, right? And make sure that people understand the business imperative for identifying and developing really underrepresented talent we need today, frankly, more than ever in operations and supply chain. So we have these three great executive role models to provide advice, and also not just for the students, but to organizations about how can they address this opportunity that's before us, really. And the issue of gender diversity in supply chain and operations in really many industries is what is sometimes called the leaky pipeline, right? It starts out okay, enough women are coming into the entry-level positions, but then as you move to director, it gets a little smaller, vice president, even smaller. And then when you get to executive, it's really quite small. In fact, Gartner in 2021, they published a story really that underlines that point. Their research showed that 41%, which is really a record right now, of women make up the supply chain workforce. So that's progress. And there was progress at most of the points in the pipeline. The issue is when you got to the very highest levels of chief supply chain officer, EVPs, presidents, things like that, it was much lower. As a matter of fact, that 41% that it started out as went down to 15% by the time you got to the top level. And when you look at women of color, it was drastically reduced. It was only 1% by the time you got to the very end. So that's sort of a little bit of backdrop to the webinar today. And it's going to be exciting to learn from these trailblazers and wonderful role models. And I'll do introductions and we'll get into some questions. And near the end of this, we're also going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. If you can use the Q&A function, that's the way to get your question across. That would be great. So first, I'd like to introduce Sheri Heinich. Sheri is Global Executive Partner, IBM Sustainability Services Lead. And IBM, while it is a worldwide name, certainly it's the global information technology company. Sheri is also affectionately known as the supply chain queen. As a matter of fact, many of the students in my program knew of her even before they joined the program. So that's very exciting. She utilizes her knowledge, her skills to really give a unique point of view in supply chain to advise those companies on sustainability, SDGs, talent and organizational development, change management, diversity as a business imperative, and strategy in digital transformation. She has over 17 years of experience leading and influencing transformation as a consultant for Fortune 500 clients. She is a self-described rebel, and I see the rebel sign up there. And she hosts a podcast called Supply Chain Revolution that I'd really encourage you to watch. One of my favorite phrases that Sheri often says is, say it until you see it. And it really has had an impact on me. She has recently obtained her second master's degree in sustainability from Harvard. And I'm also so fortunate she is a board member here for the supply chain management program at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. So welcome, Sheri.
Thank you so much, Linda.
Next, I'd like to welcome Melanie Jones. Melanie is president of Sysco North Central region, where she oversees $1.5 billion business and leads a team of 1,000 associates covering distribution operations to multiple channels of business in 5 states. Sysco with an S is the global distribution leader in food and non-food products to restaurants, healthcare, educational facilities, lodging, and customers around the world. And while I didn't share some of the statistics, but when you start looking at in Melanie's world of transportation and operations, those figures go down even more dramatically, I would say, as far as what % of the workforce are women when you're talking about front-facing operations. So Melanie's experience spans many prior roles in operations and sales in the retail, grocery, and food service industries. She was Region Vice President of Sales, Central US for Mondelez, Vice President of Target for Coca-Cola, Distribution Center Manager for McLean Distribution, Group Leader for Target, and multiple positions at Kroger. So really some industry giants that she has had major positions in. She is currently a board member at the Brand Lab. She received her bachelor's in sales and marketing from Ball State University and her MBA from Indiana Wesleyan University. And I'd like to say I consider her an advocate for lifelong learning. One of my favorite things is that Melanie recently did an article. She showed a picture of her daughter doing, I think it was a backflip or back handspring, being a former gymnast myself. I thought it was great, but it was really about leading despite fear, which is really what these athletes often have to do in many different types. And I truly value her wise counsel and advice. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
And our third panelist is Kerry Wibben. Kerry was recently promoted to the role of President, Exiger Federal Solutions, based in the McLean office. Exiger is a global market leader in technology-enabled compliance and risk management solutions and helps multiple types of organizations with risk and third-party risk management. Carrie joined Exiger from the US Department of Defense, where she was Deputy Director of the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, where she led the US government's largest security organization. She has had a distinguished career in national security and intelligence, spans 2 decades. She started her career in the US Army as an active duty military police officer after receiving her commission from the United States Military Academy, West Point. And I feel fortunate to have Carrie also as a part of our program's advisory board. She's been very, very helpful. She brings a strong passion for gender equity with her work with Exiger's employee resource group, WINS, which is Women's Initiative Network. They have a lot of activities that they do. And I saw on there when I was looking at one of their webinars, a great comment that says, nobody wins if we leave half of the team on the bench. And I really like that. So Carrie, thank you also so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Linda.
With that, I'd like to just launch into our questions. So first, I'd like to ask just if you can share some unique challenges women may face in supply chain and operations. And again, this could be from personal experience or industry data or just observations that you've had. And I'm going to start with Carrie first, just so kind of go in order here.
Sure. So thank you again for the very kind introduction, and really an honor to be on this panel with Melanie and Sheri, and of course you, Linda, such amazing and accomplished women that truly are such an inspiration to me, all of you. I feel like the imposter in the crowd because I didn't actually grow up in supply chain. I grew up, as Linda mentioned, really in the field of national security. So I summarize my past 20 years of my career by saying that, you know, eradicating evil in the world and promoting goodness is really my passion and represents my life's work. The way I backed into supply chain from national security is really, you know, based on a number of things, but, you know, the fact that our intellectual property is being stolen at an incredibly alarming rate, where, you know, 1 in every 6 North American companies has fallen victim to IP theft. And the value of that theft is estimated to be up to $600 billion annually. And the most effective way our adversaries steal our trade secrets and associated IP is by exploiting weaknesses in our supply chain. So as it relates to the supply chain field, my focus really is on that sliver of the pie, if you will, that's focused on supply chain security, resiliency, and third-party risk management. But broadening from there a little bit, you know, I think COVID-19 and the related shock effects that we're still feeling drove a degree of awareness really across the entire nation. That over-reliance on foreign source supply is a huge national security problem, economic security problem. So this intersection of, you know, national security, economic security, supply chain is really where I focus. I mentioned, you know, I'm not sure which webinar you've seen, but I've mentioned in the past many times that, you know, both the fields of supply chain and national security are really male dominated. And certainly from my background as, you know, an active duty officer, oftentimes in infantry regiments, which there are not a lot of females in, and certainly in national security more broadly as a public servant, I really witnessed women struggle to be promoted and advanced on par with their male counterparts, myself included. So I know we have a number of other things we're going to talk about, but, you know, just what I found and what I now mentor young women in these fields to do is just, you know, confidence, in my opinion, confidence trumps everything. So, and oftentimes I felt like I had to be better. I had to be better than my male counterparts to be given the same opportunity for promotion and advancement. So we'll talk more about a number of things. I want to kick it over to Sheri and Melanie for their thoughts as well.
Great, Carrie. And you often hear that phrase, I felt the need to be better. So that's something we'll probably pick up on again. Melanie, you want to share your thoughts on some unique challenges women may face?
Yeah, I think that when I think about the unique challenges that I faced in just my career, starting as a front line, like in the operations on the front line, I remember something as simple as there were years where I felt like I had to wear pants. It was almost like this defeminizing of yourself just to fit in the supply chain and operations organization. And I remember there was this moment where there was a leader that I really looked up to. And I asked her what I thought, it felt like a really deep and important question. But my question to her was, how do you know when it's appropriate to wear a dress as an operations leader? And her response to me was, if my legs are shaved, I wear a dress. And if they're not, then I wear pants. And I was just amazed that, you know, this question that felt so deep to me, her response was so simplistic. But when I look back on how much pressure I put on myself to show up as one of someone who belonged in that field, it affected things as small as how I got dressed to go to work. I mean, I think, you know, as every person does, I learned through my career that it's less about what you wear and more about the, you know, what you're doing, like Carrie just alluded to. But as you think about those small challenges that women face that men just don't, right? It was something as simple as, can I wear a skirt today? While I was being a top performer in my field. And so I think that's certainly differentiated from what others would face in this field.
That's a very interesting story, Melanie, and very telling as well. Sheri?
I would like to pick up on what Carrie and Melanie have highlighted around the need to be better. And I think that this was a narrative that I told myself earlier in my career, be so good that they can't ignore you. And I have to amend that mantra, because part of, you know, us encouraging a lot of the diverse folks who are listening, and particularly women who are listening right now, is that you have to be bold. And you know, earlier in my career, I used to say I hadn't found my voice, and I wasn't as outspoken as I am right now. I didn't think that I had the confidence that Carrie mentioned was really critical. But at the same time, now that I'm in a position to be intentional and insist on making room in my own organization for diversity, I find that the power of creating equitable workspaces goes beyond just thinking about representation and inclusion. And when you think about fitting in supply chain and operations, and then more broadly within a corporate environment, what often happens is women feel like they have to be bold or be extra or be so good. And I don't know that that's creating the right type of equity that we need. And it's certainly not sending the right message. We should, as leaders, create spaces that meet people where they are, where they can show up and be uniquely themselves. And I want to just pull it all together in that the message of being bold does not mean that you should have to scream for inclusion. And that if your voice, you know, your voice is one where you should be judged on the value that you add to others, to clients, to the world that we share, and then also to yourself. So if there's one thing, hard-earned lesson that I can impart just to kick off the discussion, is that we really need to do a better job of focusing on equitable workspaces and creating the right environment for everyone to thrive, not just those who speak loudly, have no problem, you know, raising their hand and jumping in. And that's probably one of the most eye-opening lessons from my career thus far.
That's an excellent lesson to share, really, Sheri. And I think it's important because there's so much talent that's out there that we're not utilizing. And we have introverts, extroverts, we have diversity in so many different ways, and only some of their voices are getting heard. So with that, I'd like to just ask another question of the panelists. Were there any watershed moments in your career or personal life that you said, I want to rise to that position, I want to lead, I want to be the executive? And I'll start with Sheri.
Yeah, so I think every person has this pivotal moment in their career where they have either had enough, or for me, it was certainly knowing that I had a male counterpart. We were doing the same job and I was paid significantly less than he was. So much so that I remember immediately polishing my CV, you know, calling a meeting with my boss at the time in HR. And I was like, this is, you know, I made my business case and why I should at least be making the same amount as he was. And yeah, I heard a lot of things that now I look back and I realize just it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen this way in the workplace. I think we have more transparency around gender parity and wage equity than we used to with apps like Fishbowl and Glassdoor. But certainly for me, that was the moment where I stood up and I said, I have to know my worth. And I have to understand the value that I uniquely add to an organization, to my department, to the projects I support, the customers I serve. And if you don't know your worth, you will always fight for pennies instead of demanding exactly and showing and proving that this is the value that you add in the world and in the workplace. So I think for me, it was probably that, you know, being confronted with the fact that I was making 25% less than someone doing exactly the same job, and then knowing that it's okay to speak up and it's okay to raise your hand and say, you know, this is what I'm worth and why. And I think that we should do a better job of making sure that we are fairly and justly compensated in the workplace.
What a story, really. 25% less, not one you want to hear. And there is a lot of movement on this idea of not trying to get more pay equity, things like not having to reveal your prior salary, right? Things that can sometimes impede that, because it's the value that you're bringing. With that, Melanie, maybe can you share a watershed event?
Yeah, I think, this was a moment where I think it kind of leans into what both Sheri and Carrie have already shared, but it was a moment where I was really blessed to have a woman near me who could help me to see where I was leading other women wrong. So in my 9th month of pregnancy with my 3rd child, I started a job at Coca-Cola as a head of their transportation organization for a region. And I would tell this story years later about how I worked up until the day before I gave birth to her, came back to work 2 weeks later, and put her in daycare, and just because I felt this pressure, like Carrie and Sheri both said, you got to be better, you got to be tougher, you got to work harder. And so I would tell this story about how I did that, and my dear friend who started in my life as a mentor pulled me aside one day after telling that story and said to me, she happened to be my boss when I did that. What she said was, nobody told you to come back to work and leave your child in that moment. You did that on your own, and you are leading women in the wrong way every single time you tell that story, because you make it permissive for them to also make a choice that says their child is not important in this moment. You were not pregnant in your brain. You were creating a human life. And after you gave birth to her, you were just as talented as you were when we hired you. Stop sending the wrong message to women about what they have to do after they give birth to children. And I was just so grateful. Like, when you talk about a watershed moment, number one, that I have women in my life as executives that will pull me aside and tell me when I'm leading other women wrong, because I think as a woman executive, it's very important that we send the right messages and that we're saying the right things to women as they start their career. And I wasn't saying the right thing. And so, it was that moment where you got to be a woman, even when you're showing up in ways that you think you're guiding people in the right way. And I think from that moment, I have made it just something important to me. When I have women in my organization, I am very clear to them that your first job at this moment is to bring a life into this world and to mother, and your job will be fine for you as you continue.
That's amazing that she actually took you aside and really helped you see that. And I think that tags under what Sheri was saying, is creating a different environment, not just to say we can be as good, or you have to do this and put work first. It's creating a different environment and leading your teams differently. So Carrie?
Yeah, so I will just say thanks to Sheri and Melanie both for sharing those thoughts. I think I'm going to get more out of this panel than the audience members. Really, it's just been great so far. But and we didn't coordinate on these answers, I will say, but I think just similar experiences. So for me, a watershed moment, I don't know that I can point to a moment where I said, okay, this is it. I want to be a senior executive in the government, right? But what I did have a passion for, I learned right over my career, is that I loved driving change at scale in large ways, large significant ways, really whole of government initiatives. And so I sort of learned that my ability to do that was most effectively, at the most senior level. So it was really my focus on wanting to drive change at scale and do that in the most effective way that led me to wanting to, I think, continue to move up in the career ladder, just to be able to have that greater impact on the mission. But I'll just point to one example similar to Melanie's, where I was at the White House, which is, one of the, most memorable and certainly defining experiences of my professional career. And I had an opportunity to move from the Office of Management and Budget, which is fascinating to see how the sausage is made at the macro level from a presidential budget perspective, working with Congress. But then I really wanted to work in the National Security Council. So I had an opportunity to move over, yet I found myself really at a crossroads because that is a grueling environment. There is no respect for boundaries, for time, for starts and ends to your day. You are completely reactive, as you can imagine. And I had 2 young children at home. And so it was really, for me, it was like, it's what I so wanted from a career standpoint, a professional standpoint, but it was such the wrong decision for me and my young family. And so I made the decision not to take that job and instead go to the Department of Defense and work in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Also demanding, but there is, it's all relative, and it was much less demanding. And in hindsight, making that choice, prioritizing my family over my next career move, and as I look back, in no way hurt me. In fact, everybody comes to crossroads in lives. I picked the path I did, and I everything that's happened since then is because of that choice, and it's been an amazing and a rewarding career, ever since I made that decision. And I have 2 amazing children. Of course, every mom says that, but I was there for them in a way that I wanted to be, and I felt I needed to be in those very early years when, they just need mom more. So that's just an experience for me. I don't know that it was a watershed moment. It was just, a personal choice. And as a woman, uniquely having to, make career choices while factoring in, if you are a mother, you just will constantly be faced with unique decisions like that. And I think, giving yourself permission to make the decisions that are right for you and your family, and trusting that it won't be a career ender, right? It actually could be something that just takes you down a little different path that could end up being so much better and more rewarding than the one you would have taken otherwise.
I think that's great, Carrie, sharing that advice and insights. I think people sometimes think if I do this for my family, it derails my career. That shouldn't be the case. I mean, you can make the path you want to make. You'll learn some, you may be surprised where that other path takes you. And I think, again, as long as we're creating the right environments, it shouldn't be a showstopper. It shouldn't be anything that slows you down. And, Melanie, you had just talked about a mentor and someone who was your boss. I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Melanie, what role has mentorship, sponsorship, and allyship played? And what happens when you move companies, right? Sometimes we have these sponsors and mentors that are at our current company and you move somewhere new. So any insights on that?
So, I'll start with, I tell women this all the time. In creating networks, I think women sometimes conflate friendship with mentorship and sponsorship. And the reality is, and I see men do this unfortunately better than women, is the relationship is really about how you can bring value to one another through your business and professional connections and network. And so as you think about mentorship, finding somebody that can really feed into you for that moment, but it's not a friend, right? It is somebody who it's a professional relationship. And so I think women are looking for really deep relationships through mentorship. And the reality is they're probably going to be broader and narrower, right? Less deep, more broad. And so as you think about how those then relationships have evolved for me personally, the woman that I was speaking about in my last example, Jane Grout, started as my boss's boss, definitely a sponsor. And then as we have grown over the years, has turned into an ally, a mentor, and today I would just say she's a friend. Those relationships don't always look like that. And I think just being aware of the reason and season for this, for the connection that you've made with the person is really important. I think for me, ensuring that my network and my mentors and sponsors were diverse, right? I think sometimes we tend to find networks and allies that look like us. And you mentioned that 1% specifically for African Americans. There's not a lot of people who look like me. If my network were limited to just that, I'd be at a deficit. And so just being mindful of, sometimes they're going to have different beliefs. Sometimes they might have, different jobs, or they might not be somebody you would want to go have a beer with. But, it's been people for me that I could make a professional connection with, that I could, advocate for myself and ask for things when I needed them. The example that Sheri shared about when she was paid less, I had a situation like that as well. And, happened later in my career. So I was able to leverage my network to speak on my behalf. So I didn't have to have that conversation that Sheri had to have to move the organization to pay me what I felt I was worth. And so I think those allies and sponsors take on different roles as you elevate through the organization. I'd say just starting with just practice and broadening your network is a good place to start.
Great advice. I think understanding the difference from friendship, right, and purpose, and then the breadth, not the depth necessarily that they need. I'd also like to ask Carrie, what are your thoughts? What has mentorship, sponsorship, allyship sort of played for you in your career?
Yeah, well, I think for me, again, I came from a very different background and culture than Sheri and Melanie, but in a way, I feel very fortunate. I mean, some of the best leaders this nation has produced came from, West Point and the institution that I started my career at. So military, the government, I think mentorship is more ingrained in those cultures. And I've had the amazing opportunity, to serve under some of the most incredible leaders. Again, some of whom we, I think, as a nation, regard as the strongest leaders in recent history. So, I've always been able to, I think, and I learned to really. And I'll say in the military and even in government, I moved around every 2 to 3 years, either to a new organization, new military unit, or in the government, I always intentionally, a little bit, because it was probably in my DNA from the military, after I learned everything, 80 to 90% of what I thought I could learn from a certain role, I was looking for that next thing, right? To keep moving, to keep growing, to keep being challenged, to keep, just being intellectually curious and wanting to learn and add to my toolkit. So everywhere I would go, I would really try to, kind of just take the good in what I saw in different leaders that I served under, or that I had an opportunity to support. And of course, sometimes you learn as much from bad examples as you do good examples. So all kinds of examples, and especially in the vastly male dominant environments I was in, oftentimes as the only female. Where I saw a lot of good, but there's a lot of things that I was like, okay, I've learned a lot about something I'm never going to do as a leader. A little bit different than mentorship, but I think just examples of leadership, and just as you progress throughout your career, just being cognizant and intentional about paying attention and taking the things you like about, certain leaders that you work with and serve under and support, and their style, and tucking those away and trying those on and seeing if it speaks to you. If anything we say today speaks to any of you, try it on, see if it works for you. And if not, then, then that's fine, not your thing. There's a lot of other examples. As it relates to mentorship specifically, though, I will say, I think I've had, the military and government is like a pyramid, right? So and I think industry is too, as you move up, there are fewer and fewer examples and mentors and, people at that level, or even the next level above, that you can rely on, especially women. So I did struggle to find, as I moved up in my career, other female leaders who were in my discipline, in my field. Again, very male dominated, which I think the diversity point is absolutely spot on. I find that female women leaders and mentors were just, I was able to kind of get more out of those relationships and experiences, just because of the similarity and the uniqueness of the challenge that women face in these fields. So I will say I'm fortunate, though. I found a couple of women who are still have moved in and out of government, and they are just the most wonderful, examples and leaders that I really respect, and I just point to them, and now I try to be kind of live in their example and pay that forward. So being very intentional about mentorship, making myself available, carving out time in my life to pay that forward. What a lot of women, female mentors have done for me is something that I think, in my 40s now, I'm really trying to prioritize and just carve out space for that, because it's what other people did for me.
That's wonderful that you're being very intentional about trying to be that mentor yourself, and that you've kept some of the same people within your life, no matter what, and they've moved in and out of government. And you also touched on role models even. So maybe just through observation, through what you're seeing, how role models do play a role as well, really. Sheri, some things you might add on that?
I've been jotting down notes as Carrie and Melanie were speaking. I mean, there's just so much here to unpack. I think first, just starting with what the three things mean to me in my career journey, and I'm still learning, I'm an eternal student. Mentorship is really around navigating career complexity and the right capabilities that you need to align with your ambitions and your vision of what you'd like to be most when you grow up. Sponsorship, you know, later in my career, this is really, really important. People who speak your name in rooms when you aren't present, and they have the ability to influence decisions that directly impact you. This has been a beautiful blessing, specifically at IBM. I have incredible sponsorship, unlike any other point in my career. And certainly it's one of the reasons why I wake up with purpose. I love what I do, and I certainly love the team I support and the organization that I exist in more broadly in IBM Consulting. And then allyship, this is around the supporting network, the change leadership, the capacity building, the teaming, the leaning that you need when you really start working across an organization. So there's a north and south element to these three dimensions, but then also an east and west dimension. And I think that it depends on where you are in your career and where you're going, which one you need more. I think that mindset has really been, it's been important for me. I do have a non-traditional career path. So for anyone watching or listening on demand, you know, I've been a bit of a rebel, like you see in the background, in that I didn't start out in supply chain and operations. It sort of was a series of things that didn't go right. I sort of stumbled into supply chain, if you will, but it's completely changed the course of my life path. And when you think about the stories that Melanie and Carrie have described around moving up a corporate hierarchy, I also have been a bit of a rebel in that some of you watching are probably digital natives. I made a lot of my senior relationships using digital networks and professional branding. So I didn't ask the machine for permission. I just went ahead and made that move on my own, which I think, again, it comes back to taking risks, leading with integrity, showing up as your authentic self. And if you're confident in the value that you add, you'd be surprised how the universe responds in kind. The last thing that I wanted to add is something around what Carrie mentioned around being intentional, and that if you're ever given the opportunity to be a door opener, do not take it for granted. And there are several moments that I can specifically remember in my career where I had an opportunity to either mentor in a magical moment that maybe I didn't remember, but then several years later, that person came back to me and said, that advice you gave me completely changed my life or completely changed my career position in that moment in my career. So I think making sure that you are present and that you don't take for granted, whether you're an executive or whether you're someone, an early hire professional, if you have a moment to pay it forward and give back or be that mentor or sponsor for someone, please lean in and do it, because it is so critical. It is so critical to advance equity in supply chain and operations.
Yeah, many things you said really resonate with me, Sheri. And one is that even the sponsorship that you said. So often companies have these talent management meetings, right? And they're at the higher level than you're at. And if your name doesn't come up, or if someone says something negative about your capabilities in those meetings, it means a lot. So it might not be the person that's mentored you and helped with your skills, but it is important to have those people. And you also bring up, and it's true, career paths, and I always say they're not ladders, they're jungle gyms. You go around, you can be in different areas, and that can be a huge benefit to understanding different disciplines in different areas. I see it as an advantage in many, many ways. So absolutely fantastic answers. One thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to shift for a minute because I have a lot of things I'd like to ask, but I want to ask, what are your thoughts as we've talked a bit about women, your career paths, some advice. What can organizations do to really help make sure that there is the right access? It is the right environment. How do they get and tap into this underrepresented talent that we have here? And with that, I'm going to start with Melanie.
Yeah, so, number one, I think we are now seeing there is a lot of embedded processes that just exclude women and people of color at the start. And I think we're seeing that more and more as we get more leaders like ourselves in positions where we can evaluate processes and look at what companies are doing. And so as I think about Sysco specifically, we have this process where we are looking for talent. And what we do is look at talent of our competitors and make competitive offers to try and bring in talent. Our competitors are not diverse, right? So as we're bringing in talent from our competitors, we're basically just perpetuating a non-diverse workforce because we're just kind of churning through what is already in the environment. And so one of the things I think is a responsibility of leaders like us at this level is when I first got here, I like threw a flag on that play, right? Immediately I noticed that if this is something that we want to break, if we want to see more women, people of color, even younger people, we have to break this process of just looking at what's good elsewhere and bringing it into our organization. And so I think the onus is really on us to evaluate processes, to really think through, does this make sense? Is this something that's a legacy process that might not create the outcomes that we're looking for in workforces today? And then just really get involved. And so, I spend a lot of time just talking to people who are interested in careers and just talking about, what it looked like to do what I do. I think all three of us have mentioned, I didn't come to supply chain organically. I didn't set out to be a supply chain leader. Someone asked me to think about it. And it's those moments, right, that pull you into something that's different, that I think creates diversity in these spaces, that I think is how we as leaders can bring about change in the environment.
Those are great points, Melanie. I call it fishing from the same pool. If you fish from the same pool, you're going to catch the same type of fish, right? And it's an issue overall, whether it's the way you recruit and where you recruit, or even, just networking. As you said, that breadth of the network and being different. And also, I like to come about pulling people in. And I think that's what has to happen sometimes, is recognizing potential talent and drawing that in. I had the same thing happen to me that brought me into supply chain as well. But Carrie, do you maybe want to share your thoughts on what organizations can do to really improve gender diversity when we look at these fields?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciated Melanie's comments, and I think mine are similar in that, I think it has to start at the top, from the tone that the leader of that organization sets, and then not just having it be a tone or a message, but actually seeing that effectively then implemented into that organization by way of, programs and priorities, and having data-driven recruiting efforts, and having metrics that are collected and used and utilized to inform demographic breakdowns and representation across the workforce, to be very intentional about and really mean it, right? It's one thing to say a lot of these things, but you get a pretty good sense after you've been in an organization. It doesn't take long to say, is this just lip service, or is diversity and representation really important to this organization and to the leaders who can actually make that a reality? And does that cascade down the leadership structure, right? So that, I'm at a point now where I cannot be involved in recruiting and making sure that, but I've driven that priority down through the ranks, and every leader on my team, even the lowest level managers who are really the tip of the spear and out there recruiting and trying to bring in talent, understand that diversity is important. Diversity in experience and thinking, it makes stronger organizations. And usually that's realized through diversity and representation, hiring people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and really making sure that we aren't just saying that as a core value of our organization, but it's reflected in the workforce. And I think that's just something, again, it's so easy to say, much harder to do, but I think just looking for that in whatever organization you're in, if it's not there or it's a weak, it's just a priority that clearly isn't being effectively, realized. If you're in a position to do something about it, like Melanie was, right? Just take that on, because if you don't and you're not intentional about it, it will not happen. Implicit bias is real. We all have it, and it will take over and drive our behaviors and our decisions before you even realize. And then, kind of pivoting and swinging the pendulum back the other way is really hard. So those are some of my thoughts, but completely agree with Melanie as well.
Yeah, that's, very interesting. I'm hearing intentional. I'm hearing action, not just the words. And, something that came up as you're talking about this is really, a lot of students as they graduate or, even if someone has a job and they're going to a new place, how do they know whether it's real or not? And maybe Sheri, I'll toss that up to you, and anyone can jump in there, but you may not understand the culture. You only get a certain amount of time with that company in the interview process.
I think that you're bringing out a good point. So even though you might have representation in terms of your numbers, and we all know as supply chain practitioners and leaders, you trust in God, but all others bring data. And for me, at least, representation does not tease out that experience and that feeling of inclusion. So I think that they are connected, but it's much harder to see what's tucked underneath the LinkedIn banners and Glassdoor posts that diversity is a core business value and an imperative. What you're looking for is an employee experience, how you show up in the communities where you operate, the communities you serve. How does diversity and inclusion show up in your products? How does it show up in innovation? So at least for me and my organization, I know that we've tried to pair bold thinking with big commitments. Making representation numbers a formal business priority. So driving that accountability in my own performance metrics, making sure that you have those measurable goals across every level of leadership in an organization. I think that we would be remiss without mentioning the sheer volume of women who have had to leave the workplace during the pandemic over the past 2 years. Over 5 million women have had to choose. And Melody shared a story around, returning to work with a 2-week-old infant. And this is a real paradigm that we need to shift. How are you creating programs to bring women back in the workplace? How are you able to recognize that talent exists everywhere, but access does not? So you have to really ease that entry point when you think about supply chain operations, STEM fields, where women can actually return to work, enter high growth fields, and have that barrier reduced. So they don't have to choose between being a primary caretaker or being a wage earner. And I think the work from wherever, work from here, work from anywhere, that mantra certainly is ringing true. The pandemic has highlighted a lot of the inequities that creates when people have to physically operate in a 9-to-5 work paradigm that frankly was created during a time where you didn't have two parents working in the workplace. And it was predominantly created to support, single parent male wage earners. The other thing I think is changing the requirements for jobs. So do you really need a 4-year degree? Specifically, this is something that IBM has done with a tech reentry program. We also have apprenticeship programs, our P-Tech program, where we tap into underserved communities. We have made a huge investment in HBCUs, including a $100 million investment in quantum. I think it's reaching back earlier. That's the other thing that really rings true for me, in that how are we reaching young people where they even know about supply chain and operations? I mean, I don't think anyone in my family other than me actually works in supply chain. And this is unusual, because like 40% of the world actually works in supply chain, believe it or not. But for me, I just didn't know anyone. I didn't know about it. And if I would have known, would I've made a different decision? Probably. And I think that, Linda, this goes back to what you mentioned earlier when you opened this discussion. Speak what you seek until you see what you've said. And that we really have to, again, Carrie, be intentional about what we're doing. And I think that needs to start earlier in life, that we need to reach back earlier. I think 9th grade is really that inflection point for me, where if I would have known, I would have made different life decisions.
Yeah, our feeder education system doesn't really focus on some of the business aspects. Many schools don't even teach business finance, personal household finance, and give you that broader view of what kind of jobs are out there. So people only think of the traditional jobs that are visible, maybe, emergency doctor, things like that. So I think those are all good points. And I like what you said too about the metrics. Actually, you have to measure things to really move the needle and make commitments. So it looks like IBM has made a lot of dollar commitments to move the needle, and programs. It's not going to happen. Melanie, you talked about process, you talked about programs, all great ways in really doing that. And one thing I will share too is I talked with one woman executive. She's a CEO of a company, and they've taken names off all of the resumes, so that it is no longer, when you see a resume, you will not see the name. So we know there's bias within that. That's been researched and pretty clear. So I think having those processes, and Carrie, you talked about that with recruiting, how do you make sure that you're really trying not to have the bias in there? Because we do all have bias of some type. With that, I'd like to open it up to student questions. I know one thing I'm going to add right here, I had already seen one question come in, and that was really what made the biggest difference in the career trajectory that you had? Is it education, networks, mentoring, experience? Is there anything that you can sort of point to that was the biggest difference in the actions that they can take? And it may be, when I say experience, I know I've also been told, try to get a P&L under you, or try to have this type of experience. So any thoughts on that? And Sheri, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I was really curious. I think that it was curiosity, and then my just appetite to learn. I love learning new things, having new experiences, and I wasn't afraid to take a risk. And I think that I also work hard. So not at the expense of or detriment to being a mother. I also have 3 children. They're 12, 8, and 7. But that's really important. You have to be able to believe in yourself enough to push yourself and go to the edge. And that's going to require being uncomfortable, unfortunately. There were a couple really transformation projects that I was sort of landed in my lap in my career. And at the time, it was sheer hell, frankly. And I didn't understand the power of being uncomfortable, but it was a real inflection point for growth, personal growth, professional growth, a lot of the EQ and change management skills that I had to quickly pick up. And that's really been a blessing in disguise in my career. And I've taken those experiences with me. But be curious, Be a super learner. Don't be afraid to take a risk, and bet on yourself. I mean, you have the capacity to win. And certainly I think that those are the three key areas that have taken me throughout my career that I would evangelize.
Great, thank you. Carrie, anything to add to that?
I really love Sheri's answer. Actually, I was going to speak to some of the same things, but she says it so well. I think, maybe just to say it a little differently, for me, it was, again, I think that we have so much in common. Sheri, we really should get to know each other better. But I think similarly, just being curious, just never getting stagnant, right? Just never getting comfortable. That's when I think you really do yourself a disservice. If you're feeling comfortable in your job, it's probably, my opinion, for me anyway, it always felt like, okay, time to go do something else. This doesn't feel so hard anymore. And again, it served me well because the diversity in my background, especially, working in the federal government, I worked in the intel community, I worked in defense, I worked in civilian agencies, I worked at the White House, ton of exposure with Congress. I mean, that diversity is really what ultimately led to my ability to move up the career path. And it's a very, I think more recent thing, because I think in the past you moved up by just being a deep expert in your field and staying in an organization and climbing a single ladder. And there was probably a path for that, and that was promoted, and that was the playbook. But the world's changed, and I think that's old school. So I think that is important, and just constantly challenging yourself, never settling, never getting comfortable, never being okay with that. And I think the network, I want to just talk on that, because for me, it was really, I am a very passionate person in all that I do, and my passion is what drives me. So my passion for national security is really that sort of purpose and that why. No matter what I do in my life, I know I need to have some nexus to that, and know that what I do every day is anchored to that much more important thing in that purpose. And that's just what drives me. It's not about me, it's about the greater cause. And so if you can find that, if you haven't found it yet, look for it. And you'd be amazed that if you can connect to something like that, that truly you can just be passionate about, and that really keeps you focused day to day, good days, bad days, whatever. And then whatever that passion is, just know that there's a whole network of people out there working that same priority, that same mission. Find them. The work ethic, Sheri, I agree, so important. Hardworking people who are driven by something that is bigger than themselves, who are driven by that passion, and who just want to work with other people like them. I did that in my career, especially over the last 10 years. And my network, I didn't realize how incredibly powerful and strong it is, really, until I left government. And I'm like, wow, I know across the entire federal government and the industry, people like me who were in government who have left, and that is like a bond that can't be broken. It's just so powerful, because none of us can get anything done on our own. It takes a network of like-minded, passionate people to move mountains. And so that's just been another thing I wanted to hit on.
Great advice, both on just the networking and the continuous learning and the purpose. And I know with Sheri saying that as well, you said that. And Melanie, I'd like to wrap this up, because I know we're at one, by getting your thoughts on that, but also, we've talked about network. I saw you shaking your head to some of the constant learning. I know that for you. Maybe just another question that had come up is, even how do you access these people? Like, if you're at a lower level, how do you get to people? How do you do assault? Maybe it's interviews that are not for a job, informational interviews, connecting, reaching out. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say two things. Sheri and Carrie both hit it. I think that resonates for a lot of people. The thing that I would say for me was, I developed a personal brand statement that basically is my commitment on what I will deliver if I am taking over a business, or if I'm leaning in to do a job. What is the brand that you get when you are engaging with me? And so, my personal brand statement is, I am a leader that will deliver exceptional results to a business while I develop talent specifically focused on women and people of color. right? So I'm going to deliver results. I'm going to focus on talent, and I'm going to lift as I rise. That's the kind of leader that I want to be. Then to your question, how do you get access to these people? I think this is where, I said my background has been supply chain, and I was pushed into sales, and now I'm more of a general manager. Elevating in an organization really becomes about selling yourself, right? And so it becomes, I think Sheri has mentioned this a couple of times, about advocating for yourself, reaching out. I always encourage, look 1 to 2 levels above where you are right now and cold call leaders. Just call them and say, hey, I'd love to spend 30 minutes just talking about you. I have never had a person turn me down for an opportunity to talk about themselves. And while they are talking about themselves and how they got to where they are, you can really then just begin to just pepper them with questions. Well, when you did this, what do I need to do, right? And so I think it is, we've talked a lot about allyship, sponsorship, and networking and having a network. I think Sheri's description was perfect. A lot of that comes down to your willingness to sell yourself up in an organization, and your willingness to just put yourself out there and go after what you want with a very clear grounding in what is your brand, what do you want out of your career, and what are you committing to deliver to an organization as you take greater roles.
Yeah, fantastic. I hear the brand statement, Melanie, knowing what you want. I hear purpose from all of you, and also how you do it. So I thought that was super advice that's been also echoed by your other panelists here. And I can't thank you all enough for sharing this advice on what women can do to elevate their careers and what organizations can do to tap into underrepresented talent that we really, really need at this point in the supply chain. That's for sure. So with that, I would just like to thank all the participants today for joining us. And again, for the 3 of you for just the wonderful insights and being the role models that you are for everyone.
Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much.
All right. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we will talk soon.